is Neeraj Agrawal, and a great panel to talk about the state of crypto regulation, perhaps here in the United States and beyond. Got some amazing speakers, some great friends, and the leading experts in the space. So Neeraj, I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks, David. So privacy is very much a topic related to regulation, so I'm glad we had that segue. I'm joined here today by Jerry and Peter, Jerry Brito and Peter van Valkenburgh, my colleagues at Coin Center, Zayi Massari of the law firm Davis Polk, and Preston Byrne of AndersonKill. So thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, so we don't have that much time, and there's a lot of legal minds on the stage who I know tend to love to fill time. So I'll just jump right into it. I figured the best way to go about this is people ask me policy questions all the time, and I almost never really know the answer. So I'll relay those questions to all of you. The number one thing on people's minds is sort of what happened with the FinCEN rulemaking, right? You'll all remember the big flare up towards the end of the Trump administration about a new rule. People know that we were successful in pushing the rule into the new administration, but now the question is what happens now, right? What's the state of that? So given that Jerry is my boss, I'm going to go to him first.
Bias. Very good. So I'll give sort of the brief answer of what happened and where we are, and then see what other people have to say. But you're right. The big concern for everybody is that this rule, for reasons that we can go into if you want, would have been very bad for cryptocurrency just across the board. And it was being rushed through, right? And we weren't really having an opportunity to try to communicate how we could maybe get good results without having such a terrible rule. And the best hope was to try to get it not be final before the end of the Trump administration, right? And have the rulemaking process continue into the Biden administration, because we were fairly certain that the reason it was being rushed was because the Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary Mnuchin, was driving this, and he wanted to get it done before he left office. Now that we were successful with, thanks to all the community coming together in getting this rule pushed into the Biden administration, exactly what we thought would happen is happening, which is they've pumped the brakes. They have issued basically 60 more days of comment period for this rule, which puts it back into not a rushed thing. This is now a normal rulemaking process. And just from conversations and statements from FinCEN, we feel pretty comfortable, we expect that at this point, the worst aspect of the rule, the counterparty identification piece, that were being driven kind of personally by the Secretary, are not necessarily at the top of the priority for FinCEN anymore. And I expect that at the end of the day, when a rule is issued, because there probably will be one at the end of the day in 2 or 3 months, what we'll see is the creation of a new cash transaction report for cryptocurrency, which is not something that we like, because we don't like the Bank Secrecy Act, period. But it's not something, it basically just creates parity between crypto and legacy financial institutions. So it's not something we can really complain about. So
tightly relevant to our Ethereum heavy audience. So let's say the counterparty piece is gone for now. The $10,000 reporting threshold, what would that mean for DeFi, for like sending money from Coinbase to Uniswap or something like that?
Somebody else.
Should I go?
Right.
You should go, Neeraj. You got to call on
There's a siren going by my house right now.
Good excuse, Peter. Neeraj, should I go ahead?
Yeah, go for it.
Preston, I don't want to cut you off. Yeah, I mean, look, it would mean that entities subject to the rule, that is, financial institutions, would need to create transaction reports with respect to transactions in value above $10,000. I think, to my mind, rather than what this specific rule means for DeFi, I think there are a lot of questions about how the administration, whether the just previous one or the current one, how in general is the administration going to think about DeFi and how regulators going to think about DeFi? Because I think I would just make 2 points. One is it's a mistake to think that they're not thinking about DeFi, right? It's a big mistake because they are. And second, I think it's a mistake to think that they're just going to look at DeFi exactly like they looked at the last sort of boom in crypto regulation, which is ICO tokens, right? DeFi is different, and I think they're going to look at it differently. So sorry, Neeraj, I know I took the question in a different direction, but I think it's a much bigger question than just like, how would the travel rule and the CTR requirement apply to DeFi?
The specific problem with the counterparty identification rule, which now might be dead, we can't rest yet, but might be dead, is it required name and physical address. So if I was using Ethereum through Coinbase, for example, and wanted to send to a smart contract, what is Coinbase going to record as my counterparty? There is no name, human name and physical address behind a Uniswap contract or any other smart contract on the Ethereum blockchain. So that doesn't mean that, AML and KYC regulations aren't important. And, maybe certain transactions to certain smart contracts should trigger a suspicious activity report because of something that the exchange noticed about the transaction that looked like it might have to do with money laundering. But the exchange shouldn't be required to have this very specific record keeping requirement that is non-negotiable of a name and physical address for things on the Ethereum blockchain that never have had physical addresses.
So Zaid, you actually brought up a question that I was going to ask earlier anyway. Preston, as a close observer of the regulatory space, what's different in sort of, it seems like we're in the new cycle, or whatever the traders call it, right? What's different this time from what you're seeing between 2017 and now?
What's different? The people who are being stupid about regulation have better code. So I think that's the long and short of it, is that the projects that are breaking the law are at least doing so in a creative and interesting fashion that I can really take time to read their white paper. I mean, it's an interesting distinction, right? There's some projects which just sort of barreled straight on, and they've gone and they said, okay, shit, we're going to do I'm not going to name it by name, but some projects have said, oh no, we need a token. Let's go push out a token as quickly as we can. And I think that in some instances, like for example, like SushiSwap, it is more of a borderline case from a securities law standpoint than this straight up 2017, we're just going to pre-sell tokens and then have nothing. And there'll be contracts and all the rest of it, and it'll really be a security. In this instance, it's closer to the borderline, but I still think on the wrong side of the line. Where it's more interesting is we're seeing companies that are just doing protocol development. So they're just publishing software, and then they're trying to build value-added services on top of it. So like imagine something like Lightning or a layer 2 technology. And then a company will say, well, there are other ways that we can monetize otherwise than providing a token. We can provide some type of hosted, environment for people to go run these things on, or something like that, where they're not directly participating in any financial activity, but instead what they're doing is they're an information content provider for the purposes of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which means that basically they're, more, as long as they're not conspiring with anyone to break the law, they're more or less immune and on the right side of the line. They're just saying, listen, we're publishing some code and we happen to run like an AWS type service, or we happen to have some client software which works with that code. And if you want to, use it and pay us to do this particular, programmatic function, then that's something we're willing to do. And so that's interesting. So those kinds of projects are not quite as, there are some projects which are being very clever about it, which aren't saying, listen, we're trying to cash out on our users and just run away with some shit coins, pardon the language, but they're actually developing interesting products. So I think that's the difference, is that there's innovation that's actually happening.
Yeah, one day we're going to have to do a whole cryptocurrency and 230 panel with Preston, because I know
I love 230. It's a lot of fun.
I think it's right though. There's running code for the DeFi craze, whereas the ICO craze was just about raising money on promises of future code, which is kind of like right in the heart of SEC's jurisdiction.
Yeah. So Peter, I guess to that point, because speaking of the running code thing, like rather now that there's something that exists in the world, and then there's sort of a fair distribution mechanism of something like a governance token or something like that. How does that change the thinking around the regulations for something like that?
I mean, so the argument that it takes this partially out of the SEC's jurisdiction is not at all rock solid, and I wouldn't want to present it that way. But it goes to the point that, maybe, the token actually has a real use and isn't just a way to raise capital on promises of building something that will in the end return profits. So I've never been a huge fan of the shorthand version of this, which is it's a utility token. It's not a security, because that's a impoverished and way too simple analysis. But at least there is more of a credible argument that these things are being used by people to do real things in the world, unlike a paper stock certificate, which is of course not used. It's just a marker of profits that are owed to an investor.
Can I say another way that things are a little bit different now? It's that in the ICO boom, going to the utility token point, the networks that were being launched were being developed, all tended to promise all kinds of utility that were like, maybe a different kind of communications, or maybe electricity metering, or maybe file storage, right? All kinds of different things. Now, what you're seeing is a lot of these, or where you're seeing the most action, are projects that are developing services that are financial in nature. And so the projects themselves, even if they are not issuing a token or issuing a token in a maybe more reasonable way, the service that they're providing themselves would otherwise be subject to regulation if done by a central party. So, the kind of activity that happens on, in decentralized exchange, typically you would see through a centralized regulated entity like the NASDAQ or whatever.
And just to jump in, Neeraj, this is like a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, as you might imagine. Jerry, I 100% agree. And I think there's two aspects to this that are really interesting. First of all, you're exactly right. A lot of these services are services that not only could be offered by financial intermediaries, but in fact are, right? And those financial intermediaries are regulated for it. And let's be honest, I think it really befuddles regulators how to deal with the same service being offered and frankly done in a disintermediated fashion. That's not how regulators think about their jobs, right? And so, and that's fine, right? I think that's really very, very interesting. Mm-hmm. But I think it's a mistake to think that's the end of the story, right? I think that's the beginning of the story. And sorry, Jerry, I wasn't implying that you're saying that, but not. I'm just saying hypothetically. Yeah. And then it's just the beginning, right? They're going to start to think about how to deal with this, because the consumer protection concerns are there. All of the same issues. Financial stability, frankly, as these projects get really big, are there. And then the second point is, on the governance token topic, it's so interesting because I think, in a lot of ways, these tokens were designed to avoid Howey analysis under the SEC's digital asset framework and the million factors. But I don't know that the SEC is just going to look at that framework and say, we're all good here, right? They're going to take a big step back and say, do these things look like equity? What does it mean to have a vote? What are these things actually? And that's going to be very interesting over the next year.
Well, I hope the audience is listening very carefully to this last section, because I recall at one Ethereum conference, the CoinCenter team went up and basically explained that the ICOs are probably not a great idea, and sadly, that wasn't enough to slow things down. Okay, so I guess shifting gears a little bit, another question that is sort of like top of mind for basically anyone I talk to is just now that the Biden administration has come in, there's some appointments are known. Kind of what are the tea leaves, as they say, right? What are you expecting? So I'll start with Jerry.
Neeraj, I just talked to a reporter a little bit ago about what does a Gensler SEC mean for crypto, and the answer I give to that is, so Gary Gensler was nominated to be SEC chair, and Gary is somebody who is very, very expert in cryptocurrency, right? He was teaching about cryptocurrency at MIT most recently. And I think that's positive because you've got a regulator who understands the technology, and so much of I think what we face, and I'm sure you guys in private practice face too, is when you go in to talk to regulators, you spend most of your time explaining the technology and disabusing them of mistaken ideas, et cetera. So having somebody who gets it in an expert way and is a fan of the technology is great. On the flip side, I think some will say is, yeah, but Gary Gensler is also a pretty activist, progressive regulator when it comes to investor protection, consumer protection. So isn't that bad for crypto? And he's so expert, he's going to know where all the bodies are buried. And my view of that is, well, no. I think that just gets you to have the conversations that you have to have sooner rather than later, right? Because you're going to have those conversations, and with Gary, at least, you're going to be able to have them right away. So I honestly don't, I'd love to know what Zahi thinks about this. But I don't expect the SEC's policy or sort of guidance toward what's inside and outside the line is going to change much under Gensler. I think what you might see with him is different emphases of who is targeted when and what, and why for enforcement and things like that.
Nah, these guys are going to fight yesterday's war just like they did last time. They're going to be 3 years behind the curve. It's very clear where Congress is looking to regulate, which is at the moment it's Facebook, Twitter, and all those guys. So I think I don't expect anything at least for 2 years on the regulatory front. These people are still like, what is this Bitcoin of which you speak? Is still going to be the mood in the White House, because these people were last in power when 2016, 15. So they're not going to move very quickly, I don't think.
Yeah. So the agenda is a little full. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I have to disagree, actually. Gary's been eyeball deep in crypto at MIT. He knows this stuff. I think that I agree with Jerry. I don't think he's going to necessarily try to move the line on what's a security and what's not a security. I mean, he testified, 2019 or so, in front of Congress about his views about basically how everything's a security. I don't really think he thinks that anymore. But I do think that's going to be really different. Just talking about this, about the SEC in particular, is that his bent is regulatory, right? To be honest, Jay Clayton just said, not in my backyard. Like, I don't want any crypto activities happening in any entity that's regulated by the SEC. I don't think that's appropriate. I don't want retail investors in this, which is ridiculous because crypto is inherently a retail product. But I think, to-be Chairman Gensler is going to take a very different view on that. I think if he does anything quickly-ish, and Preston, I take your point, quickly in Washington is different than quickly anywhere else. It's going to be to bring into the fold crypto into the scope of activities that regulated entities can do, whether that's broker-dealers, exchanges, investment funds, or otherwise. That's my prediction.
And that's all positive. That's creating a safe space for
I do think that one additional factor is that stable coins, and Preston, you mentioned big tech companies. Facebook, made a big splash by creating the Libra Association, which has been since renamed, and that has elevated the crypto conversation in Washington because politicians see Facebook and they see crypto together now, and it's no longer this weird cypherpunk looming threat far in the distance like Bitcoin that they don't understand. Maybe it's something much more immediate that they can have a hearing about and grill Mark Zuckerberg on. So I think the stablecoin aspect has accelerated the regulatory timeline to a certain extent, and we'll see if that's for better or for worse.
Yeah, it seems like, for example, the MasterCard news from yesterday, I think. Time is moving real fast this week. Really highlights that. Another question I get fairly often is about proof of stake. It's a big thing in the Ethereum world. Kind of all eyes are on that. So how does that, if at all, change the the regulatory outlook for Ethereum, right? Does it change, for example, CoinCenter believes that, I know that that miners aren't transmitting money, that type of thing. Like, what changes here? So,
from my perspective, it doesn't change anything. I presented in front of the CFTC's Technical Advisory Committee about the difference between proof of work and proof of stake as consensus mechanisms. You just need to treat proof of stake as if it's proof of work miners, and instead of making a proof by hashing something, they're simply proving with cryptographic keys that they control X amount of funds that are bonded or subject to slashing or any number of other possible combinations. It shouldn't change the regulatory status of the blockchain verifier, whether the proof is done using a bunch of computers or a bunch of ether.
I think from a first principle standpoint, though, there is a difference. So if you were to restart Ethereum from scratch tomorrow, and you were going to start it as a proof of stake coin, I think that is something where the initial distribution and then the subsequent consequences of that distribution, that looks a lot like a security, right? So that, when in that context, I think proof of stake still has some regulatory weakness that a proof of work system might not. And I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm not a big Bitcoin hodler who wants Ethereum to go away or anything. But I just don't think that what they're in this instance, it was clear that Ethereum, the crowd sale, was a securities offering. It's clear that they just decided it was so early. They're like, we're going to let it slide. And I think if you were going to do it again, the regulatory treatment would be different. But now that the genie's out of the bottle, I don't think anyone proposes to put it back in.
How would, and I'm sorry, Neeraj, to ask a question, but I'm curious what you guys think about this. If adopted, how would Commissioner Peirce's proposal for a safe harbor affect that calculus, right? Because you're right, Preston, it's kind of a chicken and egg problem. Staking is, some would argue, a better consensus mechanism, certainly, perhaps a more environmentally friendly, et cetera, et cetera. You want to foster that kind of innovation, but if there's chicken and egg problem with how do you do the distribution without running afoul of the law, as a regulator, somebody like, I don't know, Chairman Gensler, who wants to allow retail folks to engage in a safe way, you would want to have something like a safe harbor that would give space for projects to be able to have a distribution. Does that make sense?
I mean, yes, but if you wanted to do that, you're basically dispensing with the definition of an investment contract that we've used for 75 years. Because what you're saying is people can distribute critters, and those critters are going to be held for speculative purposes. And they look a lot like shares and a lot like securities, but you're allowed to just give them harvest.
You're not dispensing. You're it's forbearance, right? And forbearance is a very important tool that regulators have.
Right,
so maybe I could propose a way to thread this needle, right? Because in my own view, safe harbor doesn't really make sense here, right? Because I think, Preston, you're exactly right. That's a safe harbor from what? From the definition of security? Like, that's not how the SEC usually views things, right? On the other hand, one of my partners wrote an article about this that's really good. The other reality is, once something's a security, that doesn't have to mean that the full weight of the securities laws like crushes the thing, right? Instead, you could come up with a middle road that provides for a way to address the consumer protection and disclosure and other kinds of concerns the SEC might have with the product like that, but still let it be distributed to the world, gain decentralization, and get into the hands of people who want to use it without crushing it beforehand. That to me seems like a sensible regulatory path. I think the safe harbor idea probably isn't the way, but there must be another way.
I think the other thing to consider, there may be what I like to call an alien proof of work out there, which isn't as, there is a discussion around Bitcoin's proof of work as being environmentally damaging. I'm not taking a position in that discussion, but that one of the stated benefits of proof of stake is that it allows people to participate without having that high amount of capital expenditure where you have to go set up, mining equipment, whatever. You can participate in consensus by buying a set quantity of coins. There are other, proposals out there to have different types of work being performed, in particular proofs of space and proofs of time, or VDFs, which are being developed in the Ethereum ecosystem and on the periphery of the Ethereum ecosystem, which might allow people with ordinary hardware to obtain coins and allow these systems to distribute coins without necessarily needing to distribute them from a central source in the Genesis block. So that's a different development, and I think that would have different regulatory consequences.
The engineers will save us.
Yeah, essentially.
It's great. Love it.
So jumping back to DeFi, because I just thought of this as a question. So I'm just like the concept of decentralized exchange is big time on everyone's mind, right? Everyone's using Uniswap and whatever, getting all these crazy coins. So we're often asked, how is this regulated, right? And Peter, you wrote an op-ed that was very well received about that. Do you want to just summarize like there's no such thing as a decentralized exchange idea?
Yeah, I mean, in brief, the provocative title, "There's no such thing as a decentralized exchange," boiled down to, look, if it's actually decentralized, it's not a noun. It's not like a thing. Like, I'm not going to name any of the particularly popular decentralized exchanges, but you know what they are. If it's really decentralized, it's a verb. I had a decentralized exchange with Jerry, which sounds kind of fun. And so there's varying levels of centralization in this space. And the question is always, are the people who are performing those centralized activities, whether it's maintaining a front-end website, whether it's writing the code itself, instantiating on the blockchain, or benefiting somehow or transferring a governance token that relates to the changing the parameters of the decentralized exchange, are any of those activities subject to regulation? The remaining centralized choke points. And then, the article just goes through 3 topics that are relevant to answering that question. One, are these people potentially regulated for anti-money laundering purposes by FinCEN? They need to find some way to know their customers in whatever it is they're doing, because we've got people changing money here. The short answer is usually not. FinCEN's been very clear that if there is no person holding custody of crypto for other people, then they are not a money transmitter. They don't need to do the full Bank Secrecy Act compliance, which is all the AML and everything like that. The next question is securities law, much harder question.
1 minute left, so yeah. I know you love
The next question is securities law, much harder question. And then the third topic is the First Amendment and the Constitution. Like, if all you're doing is writing software, are you protected from regulation? So that's the short version of the piece. Fill the time, Neeraj.
I'm looking at you. I feel like you may have a take on that.
No, Peter basically covered it. Wow. He basically covered anything I'd say.
This is a great day for me.
I'm mellowing with old age. What can I say?
Zaidi, what is Peter missing?
Yeah, we've got maybe a minute left. So is there any, I guess, besides call your lawyer, is there any final points that you want to make to the Ethereans that are listening?
I mean, it's kind of, I think we've all kind of touched on it. If you're building something, don't think, I mean, we want to get to a world where we can build systems that are completely decentralized. And as a result, they are not subject to regulation, right? So you don't have to worry about it. But you need to think very carefully about what you're building to make sure that that is what you're doing. And you might want to talk to a lawyer to make sure that how you're doing it really is going to put you in a place where you're building something that is not subject to regulation.
Yeah. And I guess the only other thing I'd add is don't hang bait out there either. This is what Neeraj was referencing when I spoke at DevCon in 2016, I think it was. I was like, stop using the term ICO. Not because you're trying to hide from the SEC, but just because you shouldn't be taunting the SEC by using a term that comes straight from IPO, which is exactly what they regulate. And in this case, like, don't think that it's really cool to build a project where people are going to trade tokenized GameStop,
Synthetic tokenized GameStop.
Synthetic, like that is obviously a regulated activity. And if you're out there pumping your tool as a way to trade securities illicitly, it's not a good thing. It's not going to be good for you.
Yeah, honestly, that's a question I get a lot. Is that legal? I don't know.
I mean, if you're facilitating, buyers and sellers coming together to trade securities, you're supposed to be registered as a national securities exchange or alternative trading system.
Wow. What a debate. This has been fantastic. And I feel like we covered more ground in about, 30 minutes than most legal conferences do in a month. So thanks, everybody, for this wide-ranging discussion. I think everyone learned a lot, and you probably have a lot of very scared people at the other end of the computer. So thanks for that.